Nigel was a feared student in school. He was still in his final year of high school, having repeated it twice after failing all his classes and exams. Though he never bullied or bothered anyone, his reputation as a member of a notorious gang made everyone wary of him. Nigel never studied. He spent his time sleeping in class and left school whenever he felt like it. One day, a new student, Orion, joined the class. After introducing himself, the teacher assigned him to the only empty seat available, right next to Nigel. The entire class started whispering, feeling sorry for Orion for having to sit beside him. As Orion settled in, he gave Nigel a cheerful wave and a wide smile. "Hi, I guess we're seatmates. What's your name?" Nigel barely glanced at him, showed no expression, and turned away to sleep, using his bag as a pillow. Orion's hand hung awkwardly in the air before he lowered it, feeling a little disappointed. Glancing around, he noticed the rest of the class staring at him with worried expressions. When the bell rang for break time, Nigel woke up, grabbed his bag, and left the classroom without a word. For him, break time marked the end of the school day. The other students quickly surrounded Orion, urging him to stay away from Nigel. Curious, he asked why, and they shared countless scary stories about Nigel and his gang. Hearing these, Orion began to feel nervous around him too. In the days that followed, Nigel ignored Orion completely, just as he ignored everyone else, even the teachers. One day, on his way home, Orion saw a group of men harassing an older woman. She apparently owed them money, and they didn't hesitate to get violent. Orion tried to mind his own business, but when he couldn't stand it anymore, he called the police and warned the men to leave before they arrived. The men reluctantly fled, but not without warning Orion that he'd regret interfering. The men turned out to be part of the same gang as Nigel. Furious, they plotted to kidnap Orion, demand a ransom from his parents, and then end his life. When Nigel heard about their plan and realized their target was Orion, he stepped in. He told them the plan was going too far, and offered to teach Orion a lesson himself since they were classmates. After much convincing, the gang agreed to back off, but they warned Nigel they wouldn't hold back if they ever ran into Orion on the streets. The next day at school, Nigel entered the classroom. Instead of going straight to his seat to sleep as usual, he called out, "Hey." Everyone turned, surprised, wondering who he was addressing. They followed his gaze to Orion, who was chatting with some classmates. Orion froze, his nerves kicking in as he remembered all the stories he'd heard about Nigel. Nigel called again, this time pointing directly at him. "Onion, you." He motioned for Orion to come over. Orion hesitantly pointed at himself. "Me," Nigel remarked. "Is there anyone else named Onion here?" "It's actually Orion," he mumbled, walking toward Nigel cautiously. "Okay, Onion," Nigel replied, dismissively. Once Orion was close, Nigel said, "I left my school bag at the gate. Can you go grab it for me?" "Huh? Oh, sure," Orion replied, turning to leave. "Run. I need it urgently," Nigel added. Orion nodded and jogged off to the gate. When he got there, he found the bag perched on a tree branch. Letting out a sigh, he wondered how it got there. After several failed attempts to retrieve it with a stick and even trying to climb the tree, a passing janitor finally helped him get it down. When Orion returned with the bag, Nigel rummaged through it, then said, "My motorbike key isn't here. I must have dropped it around the school. Can you go look for it?" Orion exhaled deeply, visibly frustrated. "Are you mad?" Nigel asked. Orion shook his head. No, but it was obvious he was. "Make sure you're back before class starts. You don't want to get punished for being late. And don't come back without my key," Nigel added. The class watched the exchange, pitying Orion. Some even decided to distance themselves from him, afraid Nigel's attention might make them targets too. Orion searched every corner of the school for the key. When the bell rang for class, he faced a dilemma: return to class on time or keep searching. In the end, he chose to continue looking. After searching everywhere and finding nothing, Orion returned to class late and was promptly punished by being made to kneel outside. While he knelt, Nigel came out. "I couldn't find the key," Orion said quickly, "but I asked the cleaners to let me know if they find it." Nigel paused. "I just remembered I didn't ride my motorbike to school today." Orion bit his lip, suppressing his frustration. Then, to his surprise, Nigel knelt beside him. Did the teacher tell you to kneel too? Orion asked. No, Nigel replied, nonchalantly. Nigel took off his jacket, folded it, and placed it under Orion's knees. Then he pulled out a handkerchief and handed it to Orion. Orion, confused, assumed he was supposed to use it to wipe Nigel's face. As he reached out, Nigel stopped his hand, sighed, and took the handkerchief back to wipe Orion's sweaty face himself. Orion knelt in stunned silence as Nigel returned to class without a word. When the bell rang for break, Orion got up, relieved the punishment was over. Returning to his seat, he thought of borrowing notes from his classmates. But when he opened his books, he found the notes already copied. He asked around, but no one admitted to doing it. That left only Nigel. But why would Nigel copy notes for him, when he never bothered to do his own? Unlike usual, Nigel didn't leave school early that day. Instead, he stayed until the last bell, making Orion follow him around and complete ridiculous tasks. On his way home, Orion noticed Nigel walking behind him, openly following him. He slowed his pace, hoping Nigel would pass, but Nigel stopped too. When Orion walked again, so did Nigel. In the following days and weeks, the routine continued. Nigel spent his days picking on Orion and following him home afterward. It was like Nigel had a split personality. One minute, he was picking on Orion. The next minute he was being nice and helpful. This confusing behavior left Orion wondering what Nigel's true character was. Gradually, Nigel stopped picking on Orion entirely, though he still kept him close. He stayed until the end of the school day, walking with Orion as if it were his duty. One afternoon, on their way home, the group of men Orion had previously encountered spotted him. One of them sneered, "Look who it is. Seeing you again just makes my blood boil." As Orion froze, unsure of what to do, the men noticed Nigel walking behind him. Their expressions shifted to sly grins. So, one of them said, "How's dealing with this brat going? We're not exactly satisfied with what we've heard and seen." Orion turned to Nigel, confused. What are they talking about? Nigel moved in front of Orion, placing himself between him and the gang members. "Leave him alone." The men chuckled darkly. "We told you we wouldn't promise to let him off if we saw him on the streets," one of them reminded Nigel. Nigel crossed his arms. "Why are you so obsessed with a kid? Just let it go. He's not worth it." "Whose side are you on?" one of them demanded. "I'm not on anyone's side," Nigel replied. The gang members' smirks disappeared. They tried to push past Nigel to get to Orion, but Nigel blocked their way. "I said, stop. You think you're our leader or something?" one of them scoffed. Another added, "If you don't get out of the way, we won't hesitate to take you down first." Nigel still blocked their path, not moving. Without warning, one of the men punched Nigel hard in the face. Nigel stumbled, but retaliated with a punch of his own, sparking a full-blown fight. Orion stood frozen and confused. He didn't know what to do until he remembered his phone. He called the police and soon, the sound of sirens approaching sent the gang members scattering in all directions, except for Nigel. Bruised and breathing heavily, Nigel turned to Orion, asking him to go home before walking away without waiting for a response. Orion walked home, anxious for the next day to arrive so he could check on Nigel. The next day at school, Nigel was called to the headmaster's office. A video of the fight had been recorded by a passing parent and sent to the school. The headmaster said they didn't care what he did outside of school, but fighting while wearing the school uniform tarnishes the school's reputation. He had already been on thin ice, with enough warnings to fill a file. And this was the final straw. With that, he got expelled. Nigel didn't argue. He accepted the decision silently and walked out. He left school without a word to Nigel or anyone. His gang also turned against him, telling their leader what he did. He was kicked out for going against their rule of having each other's backs, no matter what. Days passed, and Nigel didn't return to school. Orion, who had been waiting for him to return, overheard some teachers talking about his expulsion. Guilt consumed Orion. He hadn't known. He thought that if not for him, Nigel wouldn't have been expelled. All this time, he'd thought Nigel was just being a pain, but now he had realized Nigel had been protecting him. He didn't even know where to look for Nigel. Nigel dropped out of school and started looking for a job. Both his parents were in prison for repeatedly committing cons, so he had to fend for himself. They never cared about him anyway. He used to make money through petty crimes with his gang, but they had kicked him out. With no other options, Nigel decided to leave school and focus on finding work. Since he only knew how to fight and use his strength, he searched for jobs that required those skills. For now, he had nowhere to live and used almost all his remaining money to rent a small rooftop house. On his first morning there, he woke up to find a little girl, Rosie, jumping out of his window. His wallet, which contained all the money he had left, was gone. Realizing what was happening, Nigel immediately sprang up and chased after her, shouting for her to stop. He soon caught up and grabbed her, snatching his wallet back. When he saw her face, he recognized her as the daughter of the rooftops owners, who lived downstairs. He asked why she was stealing and where her parents were, but Rosie ignored him, staring at his face instead. She blurted out, "Has anyone ever told you how breathtaking you look?" Nigel sighed in disbelief and asked again where her parents were. This time, she replied with a shrug, "Probably cheating on each other somewhere." Nigel's expression softened. He then asked why she wasn't in school, pointing out that she should be there at this time. Rosie replied in the same nonchalant tone, "The people paying for my fees don't even check if I go, so why should I? I hate school and everyone in my class anyway." Nigel's expression softened. He understood how she felt because he had grown up in a similar situation. Still, he told her she needed to go to school and explained that it was important. Rosie just shrugged again and smiled, asking, "Are you single?" Nigel sighed in frustration. "You shouldn't talk to strangers like this. What if I were a bad person?" Rosie smirked. "Bad boys are my type. You have to stay single until I grow up and marry you." Nigel replied, "I wouldn't marry someone who didn't go to school." Rosie grinned widely. "So if I go to school, you'll marry me?" Nigel didn't answer. Instead, he asked why she was stealing. Rosie casually replied, "No reason, just for fun." Just then, Nigel heard a growl from her stomach. With a sigh, Nigel took out the last of his money from his wallet and handed it to her, telling her to buy food and to never steal again. Rosie gleefully grabbed the money and ran back to the house. Shaking his head, Nigel returned to his room and prepared to go job hunting. After a long day of visiting different places, he finally found work as a security guard at a restaurant. The job came with a small perk. He could take home as much leftover food as he wanted. He was asked to start work immediately. At the end of his first day, as he packed food to take home, he hesitated before adding an extra portion, just in case Rosie needed it. When he got back, he found her dozing off in front of his door, still wearing her school uniform. She woke up when she heard his footsteps and excitedly stood up. "Look, I wanted to show you my uniform as proof I'm going to school now," she said. "So, will you marry me when I grow up?" Nigel chuckled softly. "By the time you grow up, I'll be an old ugly man. You'll change your mind." Rosie shook her head confidently. "Never. I will only marry you." Nigel ignored her and told her to go back home. She replied that her parents weren't home, and it was just her. Nigel couldn't help but wonder how her parents could leave her alone, wandering around, talking to strangers, and even entering their houses. "Have you eaten?" he asked. She shook her head. Nigel pulled out a packed meal and handed it to her before turning to head inside. To his surprise, Rosie tried to follow him. "Go home," he insisted. "What if someone breaks into the house while I'm alone or kidnaps me?" she countered. Nigel raised an eyebrow. "And you think I wouldn't kidnap you?" "I wouldn't mind getting kidnapped by you," Rosie replied with a grin. Nigel stared at her in disbelief. "Where do you even learn this stuff?" "Movies," she said proudly. Nigel sighed and walked over to a bench on the rooftop. "Sit here and eat while you wait for your parents." Rosie sat down beside him, so close that there was no space between them. Nigel shifted to put some space between them, but Rosie slid closer again. They repeated this until they reached the end of the bench. Finally, Nigel gave up, sighed, and started eating. Rosie, pleased, began eating too. Soon, Rosie fell asleep. Nigel gently laid her on the bench and covered her with a blanket, before sitting on the stairs to wait for her parents to return. Before long, he started dozing off himself. He woke up to see the lights in Rosie's house on. Realizing her parents were probably back, Nigel woke Rosie up and sent her downstairs. When he knocked on the door, her mom opened it, and her dad could be seen smoking in the back. Neither of them seemed worried about not finding their child at home. Rosie, who had been cheerful moments ago, now looked downcast as she walked in. Nigel spoke to her parents about how dangerous it was to leave her alone for so long. They gave him a curt thank you for his concern and shut the door without further comment. Sighing, Nigel returned to his place. In the days that followed, Nigel went to work and always brought home packed food, enough for himself and Rosie. She continued to wait for him at his door every evening, proudly showing off her school uniform to prove she was attending. Her parents stayed out late as usual, often not coming home at all and leaving only small amounts of cash for her to manage. Nigel took care of her until her parents returned, and over time, it became a habit. He grew used to her presence and treated her like a little sister, which he never had. 3 years passed, and little had changed. Nigel was still working hard and looking after Rosie, who had become a significant part of his life. Meanwhile, Orion had not forgotten Nigel. He often thought about him, wondering how he was doing, and wishing to see him again. One evening, as Nigel stood at his usual post at the restaurant entrance, a familiar face passed by with a group of friends. Nigel immediately recognized Orion, but hesitated to call out. He didn't want to interrupt Orion with his friends or break professional protocol while working. From his spot, Nigel kept glancing at the table where Orion sat with his group. At one point, Orion excused himself to use the restroom, leaving his drink unattended. Nigel noticed Orion's friends take the opportunity to slip something into his glass. Alarmed, he instinctively moved to intervene but was stopped by the manager, who asked him to help offload some deliveries to the storage room. Nigel was torn between risking his job to stop Orion from drinking whatever was in the glass, or following orders. Deciding to work quickly then return to Orion, Nigel rushed to help with the deliveries. In his haste, he accidentally broke a box of plates meant for the restaurant, which he was told would be deducted from his salary. Nigel didn't care. All he could think about was getting back to Orion. By the time he returned, it was too late. Orion had already drunk the spiked drink and was being carried out by his so-called friends. Nigel rushed over and stopped them, taking Orion from their grasp. Checking if Orion was breathing, he let out a sigh of relief when he confirmed that he was. Nigel confronted the friends, demanding to know what they had put in Orion's drink. They denied doing anything, even threatening to report Nigel and get him fired for harassment. Unfazed, Nigel retorted, "I can always find another job, but you won't always find new arms or legs to replace broken ones." His icy glare made them falter, and they finally admitted it was just a small dose of sleeping medicine, and that he'll be fine. Nigel clenched his fists, tempted to punch them, but restrained himself since he was still at work. Turning back to Orion, he gently tapped his face, trying to wake him. The friends took the opportunity to slip away. After a moment, Orion stirred, his blurry vision locking onto Nigel. "Who are you?" he murmured, squinting as he brought Nigel's face closer. "Oh, it's Nigel. You're in my dream again," Orion said with a weak smile. He hugged Nigel tightly. "Where have you been? Why did you just disappear?" Before Nigel could respond, Orion passed out again in his arms. Nigel carried him to the restaurant's resting area and returned to finish his shift. Once his shift ended, he came back for Orion, checking his bag and pockets for any clue about where he lived, but finding nothing. With no other option, Nigel decided to take Orion to his own place. The next morning, Orion opened his eyes to an unfamiliar ceiling. As he turned his head, he got startled by a short figure glaring at him. He nearly fell off the bed. The figure was Rosie, standing with her arms crossed. Before he could say anything, a familiar voice spoke. "You're awake." Orion turned to see Nigel approaching. A mix of emotions stirred within him as Nigel leaned in, checking his forehead for a fever. "How are you feeling?" Orion just stared at him, unable to find words. He had thought seeing Nigel last night was part of a dream, but now it was actually real. Slowly, he gave a small nod. Nigel handed him a cup of ginger tea. "Drink this. It'll help with the fever." Orion took the cup, but his gaze lingered on Nigel, processing the moment. Nigel then added, "You should drink it before it gets cold." Snapped back into reality, Orion quickly gulped down the tea. All the while, Rosie remained standing nearby, her glare drilling into him. Orion could feel her sharp gaze even from the corner of his eye. As Nigel took the empty cup back, Orion leaned in and whispered, "Who is she?" Rosie, overhearing him, answered before Nigel could, "His future wife." Nigel sighed. "Ignore her. She's just a kid who lives downstairs." Rosie chimed in again, "And his future wife." Nigel turned to her. "Aren't you late for school?" Rosie shrugged. "I just wanted to see who you brought home. You never bring anyone over. Now that you've seen, start heading to school," Nigel replied. Rosie kissed her teeth, but smiled widely as she waved goodbye to Nigel. As she turned to leave, her smile dropped into a glare directed at Orion, sending shivers down his spine. "She's scary," Orion muttered. "Is she?" Nigel asked, looking genuinely curious. Now it was just the two of them. Orion got up from the bed and followed Nigel to the kitchen, where he began washing the cup. After finishing, Nigel asked him who the guys he went to the restaurant with were. Orion replied they were friends he had met through an online study group. Nigel told him they had drugged him last night. He wondered what they wanted to do to him after that and asked if he wanted to involve the police. Orion scratched the back of his head. "I didn't know they were that kind of people." Nigel sighed. "I think you should stay away from them." Orion paused, his gaze softening as he looked at Nigel. "You protected me again." Nigel then remembered his past gang mates. "Did they ever bother you after I left?" he asked, concerned. Orion shook his head. "No, I never saw them again." Relieved, Nigel nodded. "That's good to hear." Orion asked, "How have you been?" "Hanging in there," Nigel replied with a small shrug. Orion nodded thoughtfully. "What about you? How have you been?" Nigel asked. "Good, I guess," Orion said. "I'm glad you're doing good," Nigel replied. After a moment of silence, Orion hesitated before asking, "Why did you leave without telling anyone?" Nigel answered, "Did I? I didn't think anyone would care." Orion looked at him. "You didn't think I'd care? You got expelled because of me." Nigel's brow furrowed. "Who told you that? Is that what you've been thinking this whole time?" "I know it was because of me," Orion said quietly. Nigel shook his head firmly. "I would have gotten expelled sooner or later. It's not your fault at all." Orion stood there silently, but deep down, he still believed it was his fault. Nigel checked his watch and realized the extended arrival time he had asked for was almost up. He called out to Orion, asking if he felt well enough to leave now or if he wanted to stay and rest a little longer. Orion held his head, claiming a slight headache and dizziness, and said he'd rather stay and rest. Nigel nodded and got ready to leave. On his way out, he paused and asked, "Will you still be here when I get back?" Orion nodded, assuring him he would. Nigel gave a brief nod and said, "All right, see you later then," before heading out. Left alone, Orion found himself smiling, as he still couldn't believe he'd met Nigel again. He felt an odd sense of satisfaction. However, the claimed dizziness soon caught up with him, and he went back to bed, falling asleep shortly after. A few hours later, he woke up, feeling a little better, but with nothing to do. Bored, he wandered around the small house. Not long after, Rosie returned from school. Hearing someone inside, she excitedly ran in, thinking Nigel had come home early. Her enthusiasm quickly turned to disappointment when she saw it was just Orion. "Oh, it's you. You're still here?" she said flatly. Orion raised an eyebrow. "Where else would I be?" "Your own house," Rosie replied without hesitation. Orion asked, "Do you hate me or something?" "Yes," Rosie answered instantly. "Why?" Orion asked, confused. "I don't know," she said, crossing her arms. "I just feel like hating you." Orion tilted his head. "Is there anything I can do to change that?" "No," she said bluntly. "All right then," Orion replied with a shrug. Later that night, when Nigel finished his shift, he decided to skip packing food from the restaurant as usual and instead stopped by the store to buy groceries. He planned to cook some chicken noodle soup for Orion. When he arrived home, Rosie ran out to meet him, with Orion following close behind. Noticing the grocery bags in Nigel's hands, Rosie asked, "Are you cooking tonight?" Nigel glanced at Orion and said, "Yeah, I thought I'd make some soup for him." Rosie squinted suspiciously. "I've been asking you to cook for me for years, but he just shows up and you're already cooking for him?" Nigel replied, "He's sick." Rosie faked a dramatic cough. "I'm sick too." Nigel shot her a knowing look and walked into the house to start prepping. Rosie turned to Orion. narrowing her eyes. "When are you leaving?" Orion smirked and replied cheekily, "Soon. But you should get used to me, because you're going to see me a lot more from now on." Rosie glared at him. "I knew you were a snake," Orion hissed teasingly at her before turning to join Nigel in the kitchen, leaving Rosie staring after him in disbelief. In the kitchen, Orion offered to help, but Nigel waved him off. "Just go sit and rest." Once the food was ready, they all sat down to eat together. At the table, Rosie kept throwing Orion sharp looks, and Orion retaliated with equally petty expressions. As the night deepened, Nigel walked Rosie back to her house, now that her parents had returned. Orion, however, didn't leave. He asked Nigel if he could stay over since it was too late to head home, and Nigel agreed. After freshening up and changing into Nigel's pajamas, the two settled into the small bed, lying next to each other. Facing him, Orion broke the silence. "It's good to see you again." Nigel raised a brow. "Really? Didn't you hate me?" Orion smiled faintly. "Honestly, I did, but I started to enjoy hanging around you. I realized that after you left." Nigel stayed quiet for a moment before murmuring, "I'm sorry for picking on you." Orion glanced at him. "Then I'm sorry for getting you expelled." Nigel shook his head. "It really wasn't your fault." "Then you don't need to apologize either," Orion replied with a small shrug. The conversation eased into stories about their lives since they last saw each other, with Orion doing most of the talking. After a while, Nigel's responses grew slower until Orion realized he had fallen asleep. Smiling to himself, Orion thought about how tired Nigel must have been. Gently, he adjusted the blanket to cover him properly, then turned over to sleep. But having napped so much during the day, he found it hard to drift off. By morning, it was time for Orion to leave. He didn't want to, but he had classes to attend. Before heading out, he asked, "Can I come over more often? I don't have any friends, and being alone most of the time is boring." Nigel nodded. "Of course, you can." In the days that followed, Orion practically made Nigel's place his second home and primary study spot. He showed up often, mostly at night after Nigel returned from work or on weekends, spending more time there than in his school dorm. Of course, Rosie was less than thrilled about his constant presence, and the two continued their silent bickering and exchanged sharp looks whenever they crossed paths. As the days went by, Orion and Nigel grew closer. One evening, Orion was studying at Nigel's place for an upcoming exam, when a sudden power outage plunged the house into darkness. Nigel lit some candles to help him see, but as the room started to grow hot, he suggested they move to the rooftop to cool off. As they stepped outside, Orion looked around and commented, "This place feels unusually quiet tonight." Nigel nodded. "Rosie's staying with her aunt during the school break." Orion remarked, "Ah, that explains the peace." As they settled on the rooftop bench, Orion returned to his notes, while Nigel leaned back and gazed up at the stars in the sky. Orion kept glancing at Nigel instead of focusing on his studies. Eventually, Nigel noticed and asked, "Do I have something on my face?" Orion shook his head. "Do you know you've really changed a lot?" Nigel raised an eyebrow, curious. "How?" "You're easier to get along with now," Orion said with a small smile. "And you talk a lot more than before." Nigel nodded thoughtfully. "Is that so?" Closing his book, Orion leaned closer to Nigel, scrutinizing his face. "But there's still one thing that hasn't changed." Nigel blinked. "What's that?" "You still rarely smile," Orion replied. Nigel tilted his head. "I do smile." Orion countered. "I've never seen you with a full-blown smile or even laughing. It's always just a faint smile." Nigel attempted to smile, but it was just as Orion had described, a barely there curve of his lips. "See?" Orion pointed out. "I can't even tell if you're smiling or not." He paused for a moment, then asked, "Is there anything that makes you laugh?" Nigel shrugged. He thought for a moment before saying, "What do you call a can opener that doesn't work?" Nigel looked at him. "What? A can opener?" Orion said with a grin. Nigel stared at him blankly, and suddenly burst into a hard laugh. Orion froze, his heart skipping a beat as he watched Nigel laugh. His face grew hot, and he instinctively placed a hand on his chest, feeling an unfamiliar flutter. The sight of Nigel's radiant smile, complete with dimples on either side, left him breathless. For a moment, Orion was completely lost in the sound of Nigel's laugh. Nigel noticed Orion's face turning red and placed his cold hands gently on Orion's cheeks. Are you okay? He asked, concern in his eyes. Orion's breath hitched at the touch, his heart racing uncontrollably. Still charmed, he shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on Nigel's face. You were fine just now, Nigel remarked, still holding Orion's face. Just then, the lights flickered back on, and Nigel suggested they head inside. Orion followed, still in a daze. As they settled into bed, Orion lay with his back to Nigel, trying to make sense of his feelings. He turned to face Nigel, intending to ask him to laugh again, but as their eyes met, the fluttering in his chest returned. He muttered, my heart just stopped. Nigel shot up immediately. Should I call an ambulance? Do we need to go to the hospital? Orion stared at him before a slow smile spread across his face. His chest swelled with realization. So this is what it feels like to be in love with someone. Nigel? Orion called out. Yeah, Nigel replied, concern still on his face. Orion then shook his head. It's nothing, he said, lying back down. Nigel wasn't convinced. Are you sure you're okay? Orion nodded, pulling the blanket over himself, smiling. I'm fine. Nigel lay down, but shot up again moments later. Are you really okay? Orion laughed quietly. I really am, he said, gently pressing Nigel's forehead back with his palm to make him lie down again. The next morning, Orion woke up to find Nigel's face right in front of him. The sight made his chest flutter all over again, and he thought, so this is what it feels like to wake up to someone you like. His moment of bliss was interrupted when Nigel asked, don't you have exams today? Orion's eyes widened as realization hit him. Oh, I forgot, he yelped, bolting upright and checking the time. He was almost late. He scrambled to get ready, rushing toward the door, only to stop and run back to Nigel. Wish me luck. Nigel blinked, then said, good luck. Orion frowned. That's not enough. Confused, Nigel glanced around before grabbing a peeled hard-boiled egg. Without warning, he shoved it into Orion's mouth. Orion froze for a second, then chuckled, his cheeks puffed with egg. He waved goodbye and dashed out the door. In the days that followed, Orion began subtly flirting with Nigel. Sometimes he would simply stare at Nigel, smiling and repeatedly calling his name for no reason, just to hear Nigel's absent-minded. Sometimes he was subtle, and other times he was more obvious. But no matter what, Nigel didn't seem to notice. One evening, Nigel stepped out of the shower, his hair damp and his skin carrying the fresh scent of soap. Orion couldn't take his eyes off him, a possessive feeling bubbling inside him. Without thinking, he leaned closer and asked, can I pursue you? Nigel paused, his expression calm as he stared at Orion. Sure. Orion blinked, taken aback. Huh, that's it? Aren't you surprised? Nigel tilted his head. Surprised about what? That I'm asking to pursue you, Orion clarified, which means I have feelings for you, and it also means I want to make you my boyfriend. Nigel shrugged lightly. I am surprised. Orion squinted at him. You don't look it. Is this a normal thing for you? Do people pursue you all the time, so it doesn't faze you anymore? Nigel shook his head. No, you're actually the first. Orion's eyes widened in disbelief. Really? Really? And you've never liked or pursued anyone before? Nope, Nigel replied simply. A sly, flirty smile spread across Orion's face. So, I'll be your first love? Nigel shook his head again. I already had a first love. Orion frowned, his lips forming a pout. But you said you've never pursued anyone. I didn't, Nigel explained. It was just a secret crush. Orion crossed his arms, his expression turning sulky. Do you still think about her? Nigel paused thoughtfully. Orion gasped. You do? Nigel let out a soft laugh. It was way back in kindergarten. I can't even remember what she looks like. Orion leaned back, his confidence returning. If I can't be your first love, then I'll be your last and only. Nigel gave a quick, amused smile at Orion's confidence. Orion asked with a mischievous glint in his eyes, what am I allowed to do while I'm pursuing you? Nigel looked at him calmly. What do you want to do? Leaning in with a flirty smile, Orion asked, can I hug you? While he wrapped his arms around Nigel. Nigel replied, you already do that. Orion pulled back slightly, still grinning. Okay, then can I hold your hand? He reached for Nigel's hand and intertwined their fingers. Like this? Nigel glanced down at their joined hands, his expression unreadable, then nodded slightly. Orion tilted his head, his face moving closer to Nigel's. Their noses almost brushed as he brought his lips close to Nigel's, their breath mingling. Hovering there, Orion asked softly, "Can I kiss you?" Nigel froze, his breath catching. His posture stayed stiff, trying to appear nonchalant. Orion smirked, his eyes scanning Nigel's face for any hint of reaction. Then, pulling back abruptly, he said, "Just kidding. I'm saving that for when I make you mine. Even though," he added, "I really want to kiss you right now." Nigel exhaled slowly, the breath he'd been holding slipping out in silence. In the days that followed, Orion developed a new habit. Every night before Nigel came home, Orion would sit on the stairs, waiting for him. When he spotted Nigel approaching, he'd run to meet him with a bright smile and wrap him in a hug. "I missed you," Orion would say, holding him tightly. "Did you miss me?" Nigel would reply teasingly, "Did I?" Later, as they lay in bed, Nigel with his back to Orion called out softly, "Nigel, came Nigel's sleepy response. "Look at me," Orion murmured. Nigel turned over, and their faces ended up close, their eyes locking. Orion gazed at Nigel with an affectionate smile that slowly spread across his face. Without a word, Orion opened his hand and tapped the bed, signaling for Nigel to hold it. Nigel, without hesitating for a second, placed his hand in Orion's. Their fingers intertwined naturally. Orion stared at Nigel's lips, his voice low. "Even though we can't kiss yet, a kiss on the cheek would be okay, right?" Before he could add that he was just joking, Nigel leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to Orion's cheek. Orion froze, his entire face heating up. Flustered and completely taken aback, he tried to turn away, but quickly realized he couldn't. Nigel was still holding his hand. He just shut his eyes tightly and muttered a hurried, "Good night." Nigel smirked lightly at Orion's flustered state. In the days that followed, Orion's confidence grew as he wholeheartedly pursued Nigel. He dragged him on casual dates during their free time, surprising him with handmade gifts and finding every opportunity to flirt. But as confident as Orion was, it all came crashing down whenever Nigel decided to flirt back. Orion would instantly become flustered, weak in the knees, and unable to meet Nigel's eyes. Rosie eventually returned home. The moment she spotted Nigel, she sprinted toward him for a hug, but before she could reach him, Orion stepped in, blocking her path. Rosie narrowed her eyes at him, clearly annoyed. "Are you homeless?" she asked before shoving him aside. She turned her attention back to Nigel, about to hug him, but he stopped her by pressing a finger against her forehead. Orion chuckled, teasing her. Rosie shot him a death glare, sizing him up before charging at him, but Orion quickly ran off and she chased after him. Nigel sighed, realizing the piece was over. One day, while Nigel was cooking, Rosie sat nearby watching him, smiling as she swung her legs, her cheeks propped up by her fists. She glanced to the side and noticed Orion sitting next to her, doing same. She gave him a suspicious look. "I knew it. You want to take Nigel away from me. He'll never be yours." Orion smirked cheekily. "Too late. He's already mine. We're a couple." "Liar," Rosie snapped. "I won't believe it unless Nigel says so himself." She got up and hurried to Nigel, calling his name. Orion panicked, waving his hands and silently signaling her to stop, but she ignored him. "Nigel, is it true?" Rosie asked. "Orion says you two are a couple." Nigel paused, glancing at Orion, who looked utterly mortified. Without any expression, Nigel turned back to Rosie and nodded. "Yes." Rosie's jaw dropped, her eyes welling with tears. "Huh?" Looking like she was on the verge of crying. Orion's eyes widened in shock, staring at Nigel in disbelief. Rosie pouted. "I don't care. As long as you're not married, I still have a chance," she declared before running off, sobbing dramatically. On her way out, Nigel couldn't resist teasing her, sticking out his tongue at her. As Rosie left, Orion realized it was just him and Nigel in the room. Nigel broke the silence. "I only said that to stop her wild imagination. Hope you don't mind." Orion replied with a flirty tone. "Oh, I mind. You can't just say things like that. I'll get the wrong impression." Nigel smirked, matching his tone. "What if your impression is right?" Orion raised an eyebrow, his voice growing softer. "Then it'd mean You're willing to be my boyfriend. Nigel leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. Is that what you're thinking? Isn't that what you're thinking? Orion countered. Nigel teased. What are you, a mind reader? Orion's eyes widened with hope. Wait, is that really what you're thinking? You're willing to be my boyfriend? Nigel chuckled. Really? Orion lightly hit Nigel's shoulder. Stop playing with me. Nigel laughed before saying, okay. But did you know I liked someone in school? It was kind of love at first sight. Orion blinked. Who? Was it before I came? Nigel shook his head. No, after. Orion frowned, ready to sulk. Who was it? Nigel smirked. Guess. Orion sighed. How would I guess? You never talked to anyone. Nigel grinned. That should make it easy to figure out. Orion thought for a moment before realizing. His eyes lit up. Wait, was it me? Nigel nodded. Orion looked amused. How? You picked on me all the time. Not that I'm holding a grudge. Nigel sighed. I'm sorry. I didn't know how else to protect you. Orion softened. I know that, but I'm still shocked. Did you stop liking me after you left? Nigel hesitated. I don't know. I did think of you from time to time, but the feelings rushed back after seeing you again. Orion paused, then asked, were you having fun watching me try to make you fall for me when you already had? Nigel smirked. Honestly, yeah. Orion folded his arms. I see. Well, I've changed my mind. I don't like you anymore. I might change it back if you pursue me. Nigel leaned in as if to kiss him, but swerved at the last second to whisper in his ear. Can you handle it? Orion tried to act cool, but it was obvious he was flustered. Try me. In the following days, it was Nigel's turn to pursue Orion, and Orion really couldn't handle Nigel's relentless flirting. His face was permanently red as Nigel gave him no breaks. Nigel could be flirty, but whenever Orion made even the slightest move or contact, Nigel would tease, you can't do that. You don't like me yet. Nigel even started sleeping on the floor whenever Orion stayed over, instead of sharing the bed as they usually did. Orion acted nonchalant, but deep down, he wanted to stop playing hard to get and just jump into Nigel's arms. One night, Nigel asked Orion out on a movie date. Of course, Orion was thrilled. At the theater, the place was filled with couples holding hands, feeding each other, and cuddling. Orion wanted to do the same with Nigel, but kept up his act. He glanced at Nigel's free hand, hesitating before slowly moving his hand toward it. Nigel noticed Orion's stares, and his hand inching closer and suppressed a smile. Just as Orion's hand brushed against his, Nigel turned to him with a teasing smirk. What are you doing? Orion quickly pulled his hand back. Nothing. The rest of the movie, Orion kept sneaking glances at Nigel, growing increasingly annoyed by the affectionate couples around them, while Nigel seemed entirely focused on the screen. When the movie ended, they walked out together. Orion trailed behind, disappointed. As they sat on Nigel's motorbike to head home, Orion wrapped his arms around Nigel for safety. Nigel gently unwrapped his hands and turned back to him. You can't do that. That's too close for someone who doesn't like me. He sighed. Okay, fine. I like you. Can I hold you now? Nigel's lips curved into a satisfied smile. And you're open to being my boyfriend? Orion replied, yes. Nigel smiled. All right then. He grabbed Orion's hands and wrapped them around his waist again. I'd kiss you right now, but there are people watching. Orion leaned close to whisper in Nigel's ear, his lips brushing against his neck. Should we go back inside? Nigel nodded, and they got off the bike, heading back into the theater. They bought tickets for a movie they didn't even check the title of, which turned out to be a horror film, not that it mattered. They didn't go back to watch the movie anyway. This time, they did everything they hadn't earlier, holding hands, feeding each other popcorn with their free hands, and just straight up flirting. At one point, as Nigel fed him another piece of popcorn, Orion remarked, don't you think we should eat something else instead of just popcorn and drinks? Nigel asked, what do you want to eat? Orion seductively trailed his gaze from Nigel's eyes to his lips. Nigel got the message, as he glanced around the theater, worried someone might notice. Orion leaned closer, his voice low. No one's watching. Nigel smiled, also leaning in, eyes fixed on Orion's lips. Orion grabbed Nigel by the collar of his jacket and crashed their lips together. Nigel parted his lips as Orion's bottom lips swept inside. Nigel's hands were everywhere, his fingers digging into Orion's hair, his palms pressing against his cheeks. Their lips moved in sync, the pressure building as the kiss deepened. The kiss was intense, filled with longing and desire. While the rest of the theater erupted in screams at the horror scenes on the screen, the only sound they heard was the heavy sound of their breaths, the smack of their lips, and the quiet slurp of their tongues. When the movie ended and the lights came back on, they left the theater. Orion wrapped his arms around Nigel's waist, resting his head against Nigel's back as they rode away on the motorbike. Midway through the drive, Nigel suddenly pulled over to the side of the road. "I think you should sleep at your own place tonight," Orion asked. "Why?" Nigel replied. "I might not be able to hold myself back." Orion immediately understood what he was hinting at and replied, "You don't have to." "I want it to." Nigel's gaze darkened slightly. "You have 5 seconds to change your mind." He began counting, but when he reached 5 and Orion remained silent, Nigel started the motorbike, speeding toward home. The moment they arrived, Nigel didn't hesitate. He climbed off, helped Orion down, and laced their fingers together as they hurried inside. As they stepped in, Nigel turned to him again. "I'm giving you one last chance to change your mind." Instead of replying, Orion cupped Nigel's face and pulled him into a heated kiss, slipping Nigel's jacket off his shoulders. Nigel kissed him back with just as much intensity, his hand sliding down to grip Orion's waist before settling on his butt. Their movements grew frantic as they stumbled toward the bed, undressing each other, their touches filled with passion and urgency. The two made their relationship official, never getting enough of each other. One day, Orion came to Nigel's house, surprised to find him home when he was supposed to be at work. "Why are you here?" Orion asked, concerned he might be sick. Nigel then said, "Can you tutor me?" Orion blinked, puzzled. "Tutor you? For what?" Nigel rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "I quit my job. I want to go back to school, upgrade my skills, get a better life, and a better job. I want to be someone you can always lean on and depend on." Orion stared at him, his heart swelling with emotion. A touched smile spread across his face, and he stepped forward to hug Nigel tightly, agreeing to help and support him. Nigel threw himself into studying with everything he had, not just for his goals, but also for the rewarding kisses Orion would sneak in whenever he did well. When exam day came, Nigel was nervous, but with Orion's support, he sat for the test and passed with flying colors, earning admission to his chosen college. Nigel had to move from the rooftop house to be closer to his new school and part-time job. When Rosie found out he was leaving, she burst into tears. Nigel promised to visit her as often as he could. Rosie just hugged Nigel, pulling Orion into the embrace as well, clinging to both of them as her tears soaked into their shirts. Nigel was heartbroken, leaving her behind, but he couldn't stay there forever. He asked her to be good and to call him whenever she needed him. After Orion graduated, he moved in with Nigel. Despite their busy lives, Nigel juggling college and his part-time job, and Orion launching his career, their relationship stayed strong. They slowly learned about each other and were each other's strongest supporters. No matter how busy life became, they always made each other a priority.